keep calm. It's only the first release of the college football playoff rankings. Everyone in the midst of freaking out, the college football playoff committee has released their first rankings. And of course, we're going to talk about it here on Mic'd Up, presented by Pittsburgh Sports Live, Pittsburgh Sports Now, and all throughout the Now family of networks. I'm your host, Mike Asti, and I am joined, as always, by Mike Vukovcan. And of course, we're going to talk about the first release of the college football playoff rankings. They have some controversy. They have some teams you figured would be there. They do have the University of Pittsburgh still sliding in there at 25 despite the loss to Miami. We're going to talk on that. We're also going to talk about Nike Sabandi and his injury for the Pitt basketball program and how that will impact Pitt basketball as they get a victory in their exhibition, but lose him. So how much of a win really is it? A lot of hype around him and potentially emerging this year with Justin Champagnie now gone. And also some NFL news, Derrick Henry's injury and the Steelers trading Melvin Ingram. They give in, they capitulate, they trade him for a 6th-round pick to the Chiefs, who initially they said they would not trade him to. So I wonder what happened to make them give in. Maybe they didn't get any better offers, but the player wanted out. He wanted a bigger role. He gets out. We'll see what his role is with the Chiefs. I'm still kind of confused how he thought it would be any different with the Steelers, but only the Steelers and Melvin Ingram really know about those conversations. So, Mike, to get us started here on this Hump Day edition of the show with two mics is just perfect for a Wednesday talk show here. Yeah. The College Football Playoff Committee releases their rankings. They release all the 25. People really care about that 4 and really care about the 10. Of course, Alabama's there. Georgia's there. Georgia is 1, of course. Alabama is 2. Clearly, the sign has been said that if Georgia would go through undefeated and Bama would beat them for the SEC title, and the only loss all year for Georgia is against Bama. Clearly, they both would get in based on kind of what this is saying. You're seeing Ohio State maybe higher than some would have thought. You're seeing Oregon up there sliding in at 4. Oklahoma, despite being undefeated out of the Big 12, they are all the way back in there at 9. I believe they slotted in at 9. You're seeing Cincinnati, despite being undefeated. They do have the top 10 win, which is unlike UCF's 2017 resume. They get in the top 10, but they're outside the top 4. So these rankings are different than the AP, for sure. Now, Michigan State, of course, in there at 3, still being undefeated with the win over Michigan. And things are going to change. These are only where they stand now. Obviously, if Michigan State would beat Ohio State or whoever else, and they would win the Big Ten and be undefeated, they're going to be there. But if they would lose, they wouldn't. Ohio State maybe could be there. Michigan, despite their loss to Michigan State, is actually in there ahead of Oklahoma, which might be controversial for some. Oregon at 4, as I said, they do have that loss to Stanford, which is a bad loss. But this all could change. If any of these teams would lose, if you have a conference winner, different things like that. Teams could get tripped up. This could easily change. It's only where we stand right now. So that is what to calm people who are freaking out and they get suckered into this every year. It's only where we are right now. But what were your initial reactions to this ranking from the committee? Because it's different than the AP. Often is, but it's really different right now. And were you even surprised, because we obviously cover Pitt at Pittsburgh Sports Now, that Pitt was still in there at 25, despite the loss to Miami with how well they played prior to that game? Obviously, they need to keep winning to stay in there.
Well, the biggest thing that I took from this was that how big of a role they look at the computer information, sure, the FBI and all that, because teams that have high numbers like that are in this. Pitt is, for instance, is like 6 in the top 10 as far as some of that information. That's way above my head, but all I know is
right.
They put a lot of weight into that. The committee chair was asked last night about USTA not being in despite being undefeated, San Antonio, and Pitt being in, and he pointed to he was asked specifically about that, and he pointed to Pitt's wins over Clemson, Virginia Tech. And
Who did you beat?
In Tennessee. Yeah.
Right.
So I have no problem with that. The only couple other points here is I think the only team that is a lock to be in, even if they lose one more game, is Georgia.
Right, 100% lock. As long as they don't lose 2 games, they're in. Yeah, they lose the conference title game, they're in. Right.
Other than that, I think the rest are to be determined, and that includes Alabama.
Yeah.
I like that Oregon is ahead of Ohio State because they gave credit to
they won. They beat them
head to head.
Right.
Yeah. They played head to head. They won. Right. A couple surprises were Wisconsin being so high, especially being over Penn State, considering
they lost head to head.
Considering they lost, and I was probably the biggest surprise that I had was Oklahoma being number 8.
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah, despite being undefeated in a Power 5 conference, I guess it's teams that they've played. A lot of that's going into that, Mike, and I'm glad to see that. I think this whole thing is a joke until they put,
sure,
the right amount of teams in there. But I have no big issues with any of the teams that are in there, especially Cincinnati.
Yeah, I don't have too much of a problem with it either. And again, you got to paraphrase. This is the first release of the college football rankings as we're speaking. This will change. As I said, even to somebody just when these rankings were released, I was very excited that Oklahoma was not in there and where they were. And I was surprised as well. I thought they'd at least be closer if they weren't in the top 4. They have been in the top 4 in the AP rankings. There's still an opportunity for any of these teams that if, say, for example, Oklahoma would go undefeated, win the conference, they then have some ranked teams on their schedule. Before the year closes, they will be playing better teams. If they get wins and get convincing wins, they could easily get in there because at that point, you're going to have some of these teams have played each other, have lost. Things are going to change. But one thing I do like, and this is something that I know a lot of people do not like, and I think we're on the same page with this, that has been what the College Football Playoff Committee has done for years, even though nobody wants to ever realize this, and they always wonder about it going into every season. They care about strength of schedule. They care about who you beat. They care about who you play. The reason why UCF wasn't in there 4 years ago, despite being undefeated, the reason why we have an undefeated team not even ranked in the top 25 this year, the reason why Coastal Carolina, they have a loss now, but if they were undefeated, clearly with that schedule, it tells me the committee wouldn't have had them near the top 4, is because if you don't play anybody of relevance, if you don't, for example, UCF didn't have any games throughout the entire 2017 season in which they played anybody in the top 15, and they claimed they were a national champion over Alabama, who played 4 top 15 teams the whole year at that point prior to the bowl game. So that's not even. That's not fair. That's just not reality. They're going to care about who you play in the strength of schedule. I do think that's why that Georgia's the only team that's a lock, but I do think that's why if Bama would beat Georgia in the SEC title game, they would get in because they at that point would have played 5 top 15 teams, including then beating the number 1. And then you're going to have a bit of a logjam. Obviously, if Michigan State wins out, they're going to get in. You could argue with the Big Ten having so many ranked teams this year, Mike, that if Michigan State would go undefeated the rest of the year, and I do want to ask you this, if Michigan State would go undefeated the rest of the year and Ohio State would beat them in the Big Ten title game, should that be treated similar to the SEC with Bama and Georgia, where Michigan State would still get in because that would be a top 4 loss and the only loss on their schedule? Or would you only do that to the SEC and then that would have to open up the door maybe for an undefeated Oklahoma if they're undefeated or somebody else, obviously? But Michigan State could have a case even with a loss like Bama potentially.
Yeah, it's always
you only have 4 spots this year.
You always have to say, we have to see what else happens. But sure. I could see that. I just don't think the Big 12, when it comes down to, and the same goes with Wake Forest. If they continue to make
they're undefeated and they're not near they're not there.
Those two, they're never going to get the benefit of the doubt when it comes to if you have to pick one or the other because of the teams that are in the conference. So much has to happen. And that's in today's, in what we saw here is just another example of, I know a lot of Pitt people were, fixated, but they were talking a lot about, what has to happen for Pitt to get in.
Right.
Even after the Western Michigan one. So much would have had to happen when you're going,
it was very unlikely, right?
Yeah, very unlikely, and that's why they're playing for what they what should be on their mind, and that's the ACC championship. When you're going up against the SEC and the Big Ten, and just the bias. I hate to say it, but
there is a bias.
Yeah,
but
there's a bias between the committee, and people look at those teams as though they're like I can tell you right now, Wisconsin and Iowa are in the top 25.
I think you got to give it to Iowa, but I don't think Wisconsin.
I don't think either of those teams. I've seen them a bunch this year. They're okay teams. They're nothing. They're nothing of.
But I think the top 10 teams, like Michigan State and Michigan and Ohio State, I think they deserve top 10 spots.
Yeah.
Maybe Michigan I could see sliding, but overall top 25.
Yeah. When you're talking about the strength of the conference, and people say, "Oh, look, Wisconsin and Iowa," and they mention as though they're great. They're not great team. They're just average teams.
That's fairly part of it.
That goes to the strength of the Big Ten. And that's what I'm saying is though when they talk about the conference, they'll throw those two teams like Minnesota too. Those are just teams that, you know what I mean? The Big Ten, I've always thought that they have a couple superior teams, just like the SEC has a lot more. And then it's a bunch of average teams.
And Penn State, I mean, they haven't looked good in a while. They're And they were thought to have high
good teams, and other than that, they're all. But you always hear about how great the Big Ten is, and I don't buy that they're this super conference that you get all the benefits of the doubt. SEC, I could go with. Big Ten, I've just never.
Yeah. Well, clearly the SEC is going to get the benefit of the doubt. And obviously they won Alabama and as they should, because again, and it doesn't matter with what's going on with conference realignment, they have, generally speaking, the most good teams. They have a depth in that conference that every other week. Bama started the year in the first 4 games playing 3 top 15 teams. Now, again, that's just hard to deal with. Who could deal with that? It's annoying to some, I'm sure, to always see the SEC there and to now see them be a super conference in the future. But they have the hardest schedules. Those teams are good enough that it is murder's row often. So, you're going to take 2 SEC teams. It'll be interesting if the Big Ten is treated that way, or if Michigan State, if they would lose, would get screwed if they have to go undefeated. It is interesting to me, even though I do not mind it, that Oregon as a conference leader is there because of the head-to-head over Ohio State. I do like that. The only surprise for me is that loss to Stanford is bad. They do have a bad loss up there, which maybe would tell Pitt fans that if they would have beat Miami, they might have got treated favorably despite their bad loss. Obviously not to the level of Stanford, but still, Western Michigan, worse loss, but maybe not that much worse. Stanford's not a good team this year. I also was kind of surprised by Baylor being there, just because we're talking about Oklahoma being undefeated and kind of getting disrespected by the committee with now a new quarterback in Caleb Williams. But yet you have some ranked teams, Oklahoma State, Baylor, you do have some ranked teams in there from the committee. So we'll see what happens. This obviously can change. And again, a lot for these teams is in front of them on the schedule. Right. Oklahoma is going to play tougher games coming up. If they barely win like they did against Kansas, they couldn't get out of Lawrence, for crying out loud. Or if they would lose, they deserve to be out. But if they go in there with Caleb Williams and win by 30 over in Oklahoma State, or finish out the year like that and they just clip off wins as Caleb Williams gets his foot under him, they then have much harder of a case. And I do think the only difference of Oklahoma and Wake Forest both being undefeated as conference leaders and being out of the top 4, and even like Cincinnati, who obviously is a group of 5 team and they don't have the tough schedule as those, but Oklahoma has a brand name. Let's face it. If they have to make a decision between Oklahoma, Wake Forest, or Cincinnati, they're going to probably bump Oklahoma in because they're a brand name. That's what's happened in recent years. I think we're in agreement here. Just last thing. The Cincinnati, obviously, they're not in there right now. They have a top 10 win. So that is the one difference versus UCF. UCF didn't have any top 15 games. They do have a top 10 win over Notre Dame, who is a top 10 team still right now. They were 9th at the time of the game. They don't play anybody of relevance coming up. And I also think, Mike, I don't know if you feel this way or if they just would have been there anyway. They have flat out been sucking the last 2 weeks against a 1-win Navy team and a 1-win Tulane team. Did that impact where they are, or would they have just been there anyway? Because they are crawling through staying undefeated. If they would lose any of these games, it's not going to be one or two drops like Michigan or if Oklahoma would lose. They could slide 10 spots because this schedule sucks the rest of the way. They have nothing else to show for their schedule outside of Notre Dame, but it is a top 10 win. That's something that Oklahoma and Wake Forest do not have, to be fair to the argument.
Yeah. Hey, I'll be honest, if I was a Cincinnati fan, I'd probably be pissed too. But I look at this objectively, and when they're looking at this and you play 12 games in 12, 13 games in a season, and you only play one team,
they did win it, but
I have no problem with them being where they are. They shouldn't be in there. You don't get challenged, and it's not their fault. It is what it is. When they go to a conference that plays more teams,
right.
then things
like the Big 12, it's going to happen.
Things can be different, but and this is why there shouldn't be. College football needs to change, and those teams shouldn't be. If you're not in the Power 5, the playoffs.
Yeah,
the playoffs should be just for Power 5 teams, and not all these other teams because they don't play anybody. So that's
no, I hear you there. Yeah,
there should be a separate there should be a separate playoffs for the teams like Coastal Carolina and all those other teams. I know they wouldn't like it, but that's just the way it is. There's no way that a committee can fairly judge these teams and put them in, because you can't make a case for like San Diego State and Fresno. Right. They're
not. And those teams didn't play anybody. The only reason why Cincinnati is being treated with this top 10 respect is because they did beat Notre Dame. If they didn't have that win, they wouldn't even be there.
I know, but they came into the season. People were this national media. They finished last year. They were on. They were a top 10 team entering the season, and that was a joke.
No, that was a joke. The only argument they have, and I'm not in favor of them being there either, is because of the Notre Dame win. I think this is 1 year, and the only way you could have the group of 5 in there, this is 1 year where you do honestly need 8 teams for this to be a fair playoff. You could legitimately do this with 8 teams, even though weirdly Oklahoma would still have a problem, but you need 8 teams. And if you do 8 teams, you could have the conference champs do a couple wild cards like for Georgia and Alabama, whoever doesn't win the conference because it's so good. And then maybe you could slide in a group of 5 if they're undefeated. They have to be undefeated as that 8 spot. That's my potential compromise. If you did a top 8, you could slide them in at 8. They would get in this year. If you still take the conference champs, as long as they have reasonable records, and then you take some wild cards, because obviously there's times where the runner-up is better than some conference champs. That would do it for them, but they're not going to get in the top 4.
No.
What I do want to transition to here on the basketball court now, still sticking with college, Nike Sibande gets injured for Pitt. A lot of hype around him, a lot of expectations around him and Jeff Capel's crew this year, because they do now need to turn it around, and fans are looking for now that special season, although this is a year, of course, without Justin Champagnie. How does that impact the Pitt basketball program this year and the expectations now?
Tough blow. Another, you just have to, I've got a bunch of messages. There's just a black cloud right now over this program. Yeah. He's not a difference maker. It's not as though you're losing a 20-point score, but he
could maybe be that. Who knows if he becomes that?
Yeah, maybe. He's a 20, he was going to be in their starting lineup. Right. He was the one guard that was able to get to the rim off the dribble. He had to sit out last season. Tough break for the kid. He's transferred over here, got screwed by the NCAA a little bit last year, had to sit out 7 games, took time to get back in the rotation. He finished the season strong. And, this happens in a meaningless exhibition game. It's going to challenge Pitt's guards. Some guys are going to be getting more minutes than they're probably planned on playing. Femi Odokali, Ithiel Horton, and then guys like Will Jeffers, who probably the 4 or 5-star kid last year from Erie. He was probably slated to be one of the first 2 guys coming off the bench. With him out now, at least to start the year until Jamarius Burton is ready, who was the transfer from Texas Tech. Jeffers is going to probably have to move into the starting lineup. And then you're going to have some other guys just going to have to, some true freshmen, the roles are going to have to increase. Bad for Capel as far as a veteran guy that he wanted to be a leader on this team and that could potentially score. But it's not going to happen, and Pitt's going to, they're one man down, and that's not good at the guard position. That'll probably be a lot of very much exposed next week when they play West Virginia against that team that plays defense.
Yeah, that's coming up. Yeah,
that's gonna hurt them next week, definitely for that. But the only positive you can look in this, and this isn't if you're trying to look at something, it's going to give some of the younger guys, the sophomores and freshmen, chance to step up and show what they can do.
It's a blow. That was the one player really you didn't want to lose, certainly early in the season. Maybe not the best player on the team, but maybe he could immerse that. I don't know if anyone thought Justin Champagny would do what he did last year prior to that season. And Nike Sibande was really playing well down the stretch for Pitt, even when they weren't winning. So that was a big deal. That's one player. And just for him emotionally and personally, you don't want to see that happen for him. Moving on here, Derrick Henry, speaking of a serious blow, suffers an injury. He's done. That's going to certainly be an issue for the Titans on the ground, who are a team that they think they could be a contender this year with a wide open conference. And then the Steelers do trade Melvin Ingram. He's now on the Chiefs. They get a win. They didn't look good against the Giants. I really thought they had to look good in that game. They crawl through it. They almost lost, for crying out loud. Patrick Mahomes is an MVP every year. They're in the Super Bowl every year, but not this year. This has been a weird year for them with a similar roster. They could easily turn it back on. There's another game this year. There's still time. They now have him. What do you make of the implications of either one of these news stories in the conference right now? Tennessee's still in there. Can the Chiefs now be much better with him? Will he have a bigger role there? And do you have any problem with a 6th-round pick for him from the Steelers? Some don't like that from Colbert. Or even the Steelers trading him to the Chiefs. They initially said they wouldn't do it. That was the initial report. They then do it, and they basically just give in to a player who clearly had a misunderstanding of his role, but I don't know how. When you have TJ Watt there and then Highsmith being so young, you had to figure that was what his role would be, but he didn't like it. He wanted more time.
I don't have a problem. If a guy doesn't want to be there, there's more problems than good that can happen with that.
Sure. Steelers have experienced that before. They've
had serious, and he's nothing, like the veteran line. He's nothing like the clown Antonio Brown and those guys are.
No. He put in the request. He didn't throw furniture off a balcony.
Right.
To be fair to him. Yeah.
There could be they've had James Harrison. They've had Legarius Blunt, running back guys that got here and didn't like how they were playing, and there were problems, and they shipped Blunt out. They cut him. They outright cut him. I don't have a problem with a 6th-round pick. I know people expect more. I think they expect like baseball trades and hockey. That's just very rarely in the NFL is that how it works.
I think they look at Melvin Ingram's resume too. They see Pro Bowl, they see his career, even though he's not playing well now. I agree with you, but I think
if he was that good, he wouldn't have signed. If he was if he was that valued around the NFL, he wouldn't have just signed a 1 year, a late 1 year deal with the Steelers for $4 million. Somebody would have scooped him up for big. It's a 6th-round pick, and later on that'll probably either be trade bait for the Steelers. They'll be able to make another trade or something like that. I don't think that's I don't at the end of the year. I don't think that's going to have any sort of impact on the Steelers. But as far as impact goes, I think the Derrick Henry trade could be one of the bigger things. That's going to be the biggest news in the NFL this year. I think it completely opened up the AFC. I don't think right now, if you had asked me the best team in the AFC right now, or a team that I would say would go to the Super Bowl, I'd have a hard time picking out of the AFC. But if I did, I'd say the Ravens.
If he was healthy, would you have said them?
I would. I like I think they would have had one of the harder teams to play. That's a playoff built team, especially with Brown and Jones and the tight end, and Tannehill, I think, is underrated. I think they're a bad matchup for teams because they could do it both ways. Now they have no threat of a running game right now, and that's going to hurt Tannehill. I think the AFC is completely wide open, and I think this just boosts the Steelers' chances to, potentially make some noise if they're able to get in there.
It also was funny. because we talked about going into the season, the Steelers' schedule would be much harder this year as a division winner, even though they lost right away in the postseason. And you're looking at the schedule saying, oh, unlike last year when they were 11-0, they face a lot of teams without their starting quarterback, a lot of teams dealing with injuries. It's going to be tougher this year. Well, again, they're facing some teams dealing with injuries like the Browns, who they just beat, banged up teams, potentially teams without their starters or key contributors. That's going to happen in every given NFL season. But so far, it's benefiting the Steelers in terms of the schedule in front of them, in terms of where they are right now and what could impact the rest of the conference. And even though the Chiefs get Melvin Ingram, the Patriots brought in Harrison. They used him a little different. They managed to get to the Super Bowl with him. That worked out for him and them better than the Steelers that year. We'll see if that happens again with Ingram and the Chiefs and the Steelers this year in this similar situation, because they have to climb uphill a little bit, and they have the Chargers. They have good teams there. Who knows?
And then the other thing, Mike, that unfortunate, tragic situation out in Vegas.
Yeah, right. That kills the Raiders. That really.
Yeah, he's their best receiver, and he's gone. That's going to obviously impact the Raiders,
right?
Which potentially impacts the Steelers. Things are just happening here, and
that was really. I mean, obviously, that's a really sad story. It's hard to even have football be the focus off of that story, but that does impact the football field because he was such an impact player. You and I actually talked about it before on the show via text, and then on the postgame show after the Steelers played the Raiders, that he's a guy to watch for. He's a big playmaker. And that hurts the franchise moving forward. They need a new head coach. They need a new top player in terms of playmaker around Carr. Carr's career is going to be impacted by that. And they're in Vegas. It's still a great job with the Raiders, but that impacts them on the field. The other impactful moves in the other conference, just lastly, is Von Miller going to the Rams. They already are so loaded. He's not what he was when he was Super Bowl MVP. He wasn't even that impactful. We saw him in Pittsburgh earlier, and he's been banged up this year. But veterans, he could turn it on there if they could use him the right way. It's going to be the very first time in his entire career, college to pro, that he's going to go into a game and have the opposing team not be scheming for him. They're going to be scheming for Aaron Donald.
Right.
He could be sitting there saying, oh, man, this is great. No, they're leaving me open because they have to worry about Aaron Donald. He's him in his prime of 10 years ago. So I would not be shocked if Von Miller ends up with a big sack in a playoff game because they're worrying about Aaron Donald over there. That really stabilizes things for LA.
Yeah, as far as I just mentioned how I had a hard time picking the AFC as far as who is that. And
Cowboys, Rams. Yeah.
And that goes with the NFC too, on the other spectrum, as far as there's a lot of great teams. I don't think there's a lot of great teams in the AFC. There's a lot of great teams, at least on paper, in the NFC, and you'd have a hard time picking, you could pick 4 or 5 teams that have a legitimate case to make the Super Bowl, and that's why the NFL is the best.
It really is. You really never know. Week to week, you're always going to be surprised. Week to week, major news stories, a major injury, a trade can just revamp the whole thing and change the whole thing. No other league has this. No other league is going to have this. And it is why that no matter what happens, no matter what scandal or controversy goes on with the NFL, it's why they don't have to release what goes on in the Washington football team investigation. They don't have to tell you what's going on, even though I'd love to hear it beyond just with the Gruden emails. They know you're going to watch anyway. You're going to cover it anyway. You're going to buy the jersey anyway. You're going to be there in the stadium anyway. Doesn't matter. And really, that's the case. That's just the reality. It's the NFL's world. We're just living in it here. That'll do it for this edition of Mic'd Up, of course, on Pittsburgh Sports Live, Pittsburgh Sports Now, and all throughout